Welcome, and thanks for joining us today. On behalf of the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, we are excited to continue the conversation of the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program's security and nonproliferation work at the Soviet Union's former nuclear weapons test site in Kazakhstan. My name is Mark Gibson. I'm honored to have been one of the few U.S. project managers responsible for overseeing DTRA's work at the Semipalatinsk test site. Today's conversation will explore Kazakhstan's decision to renounce their inherited nuclear arsenal and how securing Semipalatinsk became an important part of denuclearization. We are joined by two distinguished guests with extensive experience in U.S. diplomacy and national security affairs, as well as firsthand knowledge of the work at Semipalatinsk. Ambassador William Courtney is an adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation and also chairs the board of trustees of the Eurasia Foundation. Ambassador Courtney spent 27 years as a Foreign Service officer in the Department of State, including as the first United States ambassador to the Republic of Kazakhstan from 1992 to 1994. Ambassador Courtney has also served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director on the National Security Council staff, Ambassador to the Republic of Georgia, and Ambassador to the U.S.-Soviet Union Bilateral Consultative Commission to implement the Threshold Test Ban Treaty. Dr. Susan Koch is a Distinguished Research Fellow at the National Defense University Center for the Study of Weapons of Mass Destruction. She previously held a series of senior positions in the White House National Security Council staff and the Office of the Secretary of Defense as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Threat Reduction Policy, where she directly shaped the early years of the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. On the occasion of the program's 25th anniversary in 2016, Dr. Koch was awarded the inaugural Department of Defense Nunn-Lugar Trailblazer Award by then Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter. So this first question is for both of you. Ambassador Courtney, we'll start with you and then have Dr. Koch pick it up where you leave off. Thinking back to the fall of the Soviet Union, what was your biggest fear in terms of nuclear security? What was especially challenging or unique about Kazakhstan?
So the biggest fears at the beginning had to do with Russia. One example, we heard of an SS-25 unit in which the soldiers who ran it left the weapons and went into town looking for food one evening. That was pretty scary. We were concerned about the unguarded transportation of tactical nuclear weapons because before the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviets were moving tactical nuclear weapons from all 15 of the republics, moving back to Soviet Union, to the national storage sites, the Soviet Union. But we weren't sure how safe that was. We were very concerned about loose nukes. At that point, we didn't know because there was a lot of poverty in Russia. We were concerned that soldiers might try to sell nuclear weapons. And then we were concerned about scientists and engineers going off to work for proliferating countries. And that was a reason to worry about. And we were worried about the nuclear supply chain, the various parts of the nuclear supply chain being corrupted and being provided to proliferators. With regard to Kazakhstan, the special concern was that Semipalatinsk was the only national storage site outside Russia. And so we knew it had a lot of stuff. We presumed it was reasonably well guarded, but that was a concern. But it was not as serious a concern as the other issues.
Dr. Koch?
Well, if you take a broader definition of nuclear security, as I would, our primary concern in Kazakhstan, as in Ukraine and Belarus, was the avoiding the retention of nuclear warheads and delivery systems. So moving warheads to Russia and eliminating the delivery systems. And as Bill said, what was special compared to Ukraine and Belarus about Kazakhstan was that we saw was the test site. And we wanted to ensure that it would never be used again. Concern about nuclear material specifically in Kazakhstan came later, and particularly with the discovery of the 500 plus kilograms of highly enriched uranium at Olba, and then subsequently the concern about potential material security proliferation from the test site.
Yeah, Kazakhstan is unique in that President Nazarbayev actually, before they became an independent country, made the decision to close down the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site. Ambassador Courtney, you had the privilege of being the first U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan. What set Kazakhstan and its leaders apart in terms of that decision to denuclearize?
So what set Kazakhstan apart? First, uniquely in the Soviet Union, there was an organized anti-nuclear movement, the Nevada Semipalatinsk movement, headed by Oljas Suleimanov. And that had been organized in part because Gorbachev was trying to allow some expression from civil society to relieve some of the pressures. And so he thought that environmental NGOs might be one politically safe way to do it. But as it turned out, Nevada Semipalatinsk became a powerful movement, had quite a hold in Kazakhstan. And President Nazarbayev's decision in August 1991 to close the test site came with a lot of popular support. The second issue that stood Kazakhstan apart was the lack of animus or bitter animus toward Moscow. So by comparison with Ukraine, where there were a lot of concerns about nuclear threats from Russia in the future, Kazakhstan really didn't have those kinds of concerns. Kazakhstan was willing to work cooperatively with Moscow in the denuclearization effort in a way different from Ukraine. A third thing that set Kazakhstan apart, let's say from Ukraine or Belarus, is Kazakhstan was geographically isolated, wholly dependent on Russia for transportation to and from world markets. So there was an incentive to cooperate with Russia in the nuclear area that was greater than for the other two.
Can you comment on Kazakhstan's progression from what would have been a nuclear weapon state to one that is now actively seeking a world without nuclear weapons?
So nonproliferation, President Nazarbayev understood fairly early on, could be important for him in two respects. One, the Secretary of State, James Baker, flew to Kazakhstan in September 1991 and December 1991, both times before the Soviet Union officially collapsed, developed a relationship with Nazarbayev. Nazarbayev understood that denuclearization was going to be critical to attracting U.S. support for the independence of his country and to attracting U.S. oil companies to come exploit Caspian oil reserves, which had not been exploited in the Soviet period because of technology challenges. So President Nazarbayev understood right away that denuclearization was critical for that. And as time went on, he understood that denuclearization would be important to help legitimize him with his own people, because of the Nevada Semipalatinsk movement had created animus toward nuclear things, and it helped Nazarbayev legitimize himself as a leader of an emerging middle power internationally. Nazarbayev has consistently pursued that strategy throughout the last 3 decades. Most recently, hosting the IAEA Nuclear Fuel Bank has been another effort by Kazakhstan, which has received a lot of international support. So it's been good for Kazakhstan's global ambitions. And Kazakhstan has pursued global ambitions in great part because it sees this as a way to help reassure the world that Kazakhstan works with everybody, it's cooperative. Even though Russia and China are giants on its borders, Kazakhstan is willing to work with everyone.
In follow-up to both of you, the dissolution of the Soviet Union instantly created multiple new nuclear proliferation threats. Dr. Koch, we'll start with you. In your opinions, where did the Semipalatinsk test site fall along that spectrum of threats before Kazakhstan made known its intent to denuclearize? Can you help explain the magnitude to the listeners of 456 nuclear weapons tests over a 40-year period?
It was overwhelming. I don't know, because of security issues, how much the general public followed the Soviet testing program, although early on, in the days of atmospheric testing, before the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, that was known because the Soviets had some massive tests, far larger than anything we did in the atmosphere. And and as you know, I mean, all these years later, to go to Semipalatinsk, it's like being on the moon. It's so desolate. It's so huge. And Deglan Mountain, where we did so much work, started being used after the test ban treaty, when tests had to be below ground. But it was a constant fact of life, these huge Soviet tests that concerned us greatly.
Ambassador Courtney, how about you? Where did you see Semipalatinsk kind of falling on that spectrum of nuclear threats emanating from the dissolution of the Soviet Union?
So before Soviet Union collapsed, much of what we knew about Kazakhstan was from aircraft sampling of nuclear tests, especially as Dr. Koch pointed out in the atmospheric test period. But even after 1963, when the tests were underground, the Soviets had a practice of venting a number of nuclear tests. They did not fully contain the tests underground. And so we conducted aircraft sampling. So we were able to have some idea of what was being tested. The isotopic composition of the gases released provided some information about what was happening. But then, of course, the most important on-the-ground experience was in the negotiations that Dr. Paul Robinson led with the Soviets to develop a verification protocol for the Threshold Test Ban Treaty. There was a nuclear verification experiment, a joint verification experiment, JVE, in Kazakhstan, which DITRA basically ran, and that took place before the Soviet Union collapsed. We did downhole monitoring there, and of course the Soviets did the same at MTS. So that provided us some information about what was going on there.
So, Dr. Koch, back in Washington at the time, was there consensus in the U.S. policymaking community that denuclearization ought to be a priority, or were there skeptics in Congress and the executive branch who preferred a less direct approach?
There were rumors about some in the executive branch being less concerned about nuclear weapons in Ukraine, Belarus, and/or Kazakhstan than they were about Russia. I don't know if those were true or not, but they were ended by early September 1991, when President George H.W. Bush made very clear where he stood on nuclear warhead proliferation from the weakness and very likely dissolution of the Soviet Union. That led to the presidential nuclear initiatives of September 27th, 1991, wherein we agreed on a unilateral reciprocal basis to eliminate all of our ground-launched short-range nuclear weapons. And a strong incentive for that proposal on the part of the United States was to deal with the short-range nuclear warheads outside of Russia, and both to move them into more secure locations and also to serve as an encouragement to Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan eventually to denuclearize once they became independent. And I never heard anyone talk about that not being a primary aim of the United States, to ensure that there only be one nuclear weapons state from the Soviet Union. You had, as Bill said, Baker went to Kazakhstan as well as the other three early on. I was on his trip in December. It's the first time I had been in Kazakhstan, first time many of us had been in Kazakhstan. And that was the main focus of his trip. in addition to introducing them to CTR, which was brand new. It had been just passed not even 10 days before. And Baker went and then was deeply, deeply involved in the negotiations that led to the Lisbon Protocol in May 1992, where they committed to joining the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states and in side letters to eliminate the strategic offensive delivery vehicles on their soil. If I could, about attitudes towards CTR, it was just a congressional initiative, not an administration idea. Some of the administration were not delighted about it, but there wasn't opposition. And a key element was the initial CTR authorization had no appropriation to go with it for the first 2 years. And Secretary of Defense Cheney authorized the use of DoD funds to fund the program for those first 2 years, and that was critical, absolutely critical. Congress, many in Congress thought CTR was a way of propping up Russia, independent Russia, to be able to rise again as an adversary. So it took a long time for there to be consensus in favor of the program, which held from 2001 on.
So in practice, you were on the National Security Council staff at the time, and you mentioned we had 4 suddenly new kind of threats that had to be looked at individually. Kazakhstan obviously wasn't the only former Soviet state with immediate nuclear security concerns. In your experience, did the interagency approach these problem sets together or individually off the bat?
Mostly together. We had, so for example, it was not for nothing that Baker went to all 4 capitals. And the follow-on first interagency delegation at the under and assistant secretary level, which was in mid-January 1992, that I was on as well. Again, all 4. We were very careful about that. But over time, of course, each presented different issues. You couldn't have a one-size-fits-all, but we tried very, very hard to treat the 3 and where appropriate the 4 in the same way. For example, it was very important once we had the first CTR umbrella agreement with Russia to have identical, or at least very, very similar umbrella agreements with the other 3 to treat them fairly and equally.
Ambassador Courtney, what do you recall about the closure of the Semipalatinsk test site in August of 1991? Did you view that decision as a signal of things to come for an independent Kazakhstan?
No, at that point, not. So at that time, I headed the U.S. Delegation in Geneva that was working out measures for practical implementation of the threshold test ban treaty protocol that Dr. Robertson had negotiated. Viktor Mikhailov was my counterpart in those negotiations. He was later Minister of Atomic Energy in Manhattan. He, I think, had pretty much headed the Soviet nuclear testing site, Soviet nuclear testing program. So we would have conversations in between negotiating sessions. He smoked a lot, so we had to take smoking breaks fairly often. I remember one time asking him about the public unrest that we had read about in the newspapers around Semipalatinsk and around Novaya Zemlya and the Arkhangelsk Oblast. And he was angry at that opposition. At one time, I asked him, "Well, how many Kazakhs, ethnic Kazakhs, did you employ at Semipalatinsk?" He blew out a snort of smoke and said 3, and smiled. So was clear that he didn't understand what he needed to do to have better relations with the local community in Semipalatinsk. And that probably had something to do with why opposition was so strong to close down the test site. But at that time, that was August 1991, I was not among those who predicted the Soviet Union would collapse on Christmas Day that year.
Did the U.S. play any role at all in encouraging President Nazarbayev at that point to close the test site, or was that pretty much hands off for us, given that they were still part of the Soviet Union?
I'm not aware of what discussions, if any, there were between the U.S. and President Nazarbayev prior to August 1991. I would doubt that there was much discussion on nuclear matters with him. The only negotiation with him, or discussion at that point with him, was Chevron was talking with him about exploiting a Tengiz oil deposit in western Kazakhstan, but I'm not aware that there were nuclear discussions.
Dr. Koch, closing Semipalatinsk coincided with the founding of the CTR program, but it wasn't until a few years later in 1994 when CTR actually began working there. Once the CTR program was established, what role did it play in negotiations and ultimately in the efforts at STS?
It was critical. The delay, of course, from 91 until late 93, early 94 in getting the program underway was because of Kazakhstan's difficulty in finally accepting its and solidifying its NPT and Start 1 commitments, as well as the CTR umbrella agreement. So it was all a package of agreements in December of 93 when Vice President Gore visited Almaty. But CTR was essential to the achievement of our denuclearization goals across the board of warhead removal, strategic force elimination, infrastructure elimination, and in time, material security. I can't imagine it going as smoothly as it did once it was underway without CTR.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. The Soviet Union collapsed not after the failed putsch in August 1991. It collapsed at the end of the year, basically when the Soviet Union went bankrupt. So at the very beginning, Kazakhstan literally had no foreign exchange to speak of. The whole idea that Kazakhstan would fund the destruction of the 108 SS-18 silos, that Kazakhstan would fund the remediation of Semipalatinsk, or the biological anthrax production effort at Stepnogorsk, or the open-air biological testing on the Renaissance Island in the Aral Sea. None of that would have happened without the CTR program. It was one of the most high-minded efforts of U.S. foreign policy, which ultimately, as Dr. Cook has pointed out, obtained bipartisan support in Congress, and that support is held for 30 years.
Yes, it's hard to capture what it was like in Kazakhstan in the early days. Bill lived it. I just visited occasionally.
Ambassador Courtney, one of the things that makes our CTR's work at Semipalatinsk so unique is the extent to which Russia has and was involved over the years. Did you ever receive any reaction from the Russian Federation to the idea that American experts would be assisting with infrastructure elimination at the former test site?
So I'm not aware of Russian concerns. For Russia, as I mentioned, Semipalatinsk was the only national storage site located outside Russia. So Russia played a critical role in pulling back both weapons or devices, if you will, explosive devices and materials from there. Kazakhstan never interfered in any of that, so I'm not aware of any particular concern. I was aware later in the Project Sapphire effort when we were made aware of highly enriched uranium at the Ulba factory in Semipalatinsk. The U.S. first offered that to Russia, for Russia to take it back because it was Russian origin fuel, so it would make sense for it to go back to Russia. But we were surprised that at first the senior Russian official said that it couldn't be there, and then later at a higher level, a very senior person in the White House approached Russian leadership, and they said they didn't want it. So then we had to bring it back. That was the first time I was aware of specific Russian leadership views on this, and we were puzzled, and I think still puzzled why Russia didn't want the material back then.
Ambassador Courtney, for those who aren't as familiar with Project Sapphire, could you give a little background on how that started and how it's really influenced nuclear security cooperation with Kazakhstan since then?
Because of the confidence that had been built with the Kazakhstanis in the overall denuclearization effort at the beginning, with regard to Kazakhstan's agreeing to join the nonproliferation treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state, and because of the requirement of the NPT that it declare anything that will be a sensitive nuclear material. The Kazakhstanis approached the embassy in 1993, saying that they had highly enriched uranium at this factory, Ust-Kamenogorsk, in Ust-Kamenogorsk, the Ulba factory. We sent a specialist up there who assessed that there were 600 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. And then the embassy proposed to Washington that work out a solution to try to retrieve this, or return it to safe storage in Russia, whatever the best way was. And then for most of the next year, Washington went through some complex and quite successful efforts to get that done.
Well, it took a while for Washington to get organized. Again, we were caught unawares. Washington was reluctant to pay for the HEU. We already had our program with Russia, which became known as megatons to megawatts, that we used low enriched uranium derived from warhead material, dismantled warhead material, and that in our production of civil nuclear fuel. That program paid for itself. So that was our experience with dealing with HEU reduction in the former Soviet Union. It took a while and good cooperation from the Kazakhstan government to work out a system whereby we didn't directly pay, but we broadened our cooperative efforts, so made everyone satisfied. It also took a while for the various elements of the bureaucracy to learn that this was a priority. And now it was a massive undertaking. And again, it was very important to have strong support within the Washington leadership. And here, the voice of Secretary Perry, Secretary of Defense at the time, and Assistant Secretary, as he was, Ash Carter, who was my immediate boss, to get it underway and keep it going. And Ash created an interagency Tiger team led by my deputy, Jeff Starr. And Jeff had all the right people. I'm thinking of the Joint Staff Representative, who was key in keeping Air Force support for the transport of the material out of Kazakhstan. And it took some months, of course, for the DOE team to pack the material and prepare it for transport, and then the transport out, all in secrecy. Secrecy that was preserved. and towards the very, very end, there was a journalist who got wind of the program. And we prevailed on this journalist not to publish. And it wasn't published. Saying it will be made public very soon. And it became public after the material was safely stored at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. So it's also the first time in my memory, I think, that we had to deal with state government. We had to deal with environmental regulations regarding the transport and storage of nuclear materials. This was all new to us, us in the nonproliferation arms control business. So it was, talk about a broad whole of government effort. This was perhaps one of the first and very, very successful.
Yes, it was successful. So at the end, the Department of Energy sent specialists out to Semipalatinsk. They carefully packed the uranium. Of course, it had to be packed in a way that it wouldn't go critical, so there were special spacing and other things. And then the Air Force supplied several C-5s, the largest Air Force cargo plane. Mm-hmm. Those C-5s took off from Semipalatinsk and flew nonstop, the longest flight C-5s had ever taken, I understand, to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, with air-to-air refueling 4, 5, 6 times all along the way. Then the material was taken off the Air Force planes, put into special SST trucks that the Department of Energy uses to transport nuclear materials. And then, as Dr. Koch pointed out, it went down to Y-12 at Oak Ridge. I was in Kazakhstan, and so I only heard this indirectly, but I gather that one of the concerns was that there not be anti-nuclear protesters lying in front of the gate to Y-12 to prevent the trucks from coming in. And I believe Vice President Gore actually personally engaged the governor of Tennessee to help facilitate all that. But it turned out to be a success. And then the next day, in what is truly first, maybe last, we had the Secretary of State, Secretary of Energy, and Secretary Perry conduct a joint press conference at the Department of Defense to talk about what had taken place. And again, had a lot of bipartisan support.
Could either of you speak to the ability of having a program like CTR at that point, and the criticality of being able to use that to bring it all together? Because it was certainly a interagency success, and couldn't have been done by any one group by itself. But was that kind of a early inclination of what CTR really could be used for in the future?
Well, it was essential, and we discovered a certain degree of flexibility in being able to use CTR for purposes that we hadn't initially, of which we had not initially been aware, and that without it, and in retrospect, the amount of the package associated with Project Sapphire was probably one of the great bargains in government history, given the importance of getting rid of that material. Securing it and ensuring that it was disposed of safely and securely was. I don't know what we would have done without CTR.
Yeah, CTR paid for the Defense Department share of the costs. DOE paid for its costs, and then the Department of State paid for the separated work unit, the SWU value of the uranium. So all the agencies participated together.
And DOE is I'm one of those people who talks about there's DoD CTR and then there's big CTR, because the DOE program is a direct offshoot of CTR, and so it was part of the larger CTR effort. Project Sapphire was key in that regard. We were concerned about material security in the CTR program from the very beginning, from the very first year. But we were concerned about material security in Russia because that's where we thought the material was. Sapphire changed everything, because at least the likes of me had no idea that material was there, and raised the question of what else. So we immediately with Sapphire, we became aware, and it took us a while as a bureaucracy to act on the Sapphire discovery. In retrospect, it's hard to imagine that we didn't immediately move, but we weren't prepared for it, and it just took a while until the bureaucracy was given an incentive by very senior administration leadership, including in DoD, and so which helped concentrate the minds. So we became aware of material security problems outside of Russia. With STS specifically, it was a couple of years later, as I recall, that we learned about the scavengers on the site, who seemed to be looking for copper wire, and we had the pictures of the removal of copper wire from experiment sites outside the mountain, outside of Degelin Mountain. So DOE dealt, as I recall, it was primarily DOE that dealt with those sites. We thought initially, for some time, that closing the test tunnels at Degelin would solve the proliferation problem, as well as the infrastructure problem. The last test tunnel was closed in July of 2000. It was, I don't remember exactly when, but a couple of years later, by that time I was once again on the NSC staff, my boss and I got a briefing that was both eye-opening and very disturbing. And that was the beginning of the follow-on project, specifically devoted to nuclear material security, that was kept very, very quiet. And it was publicly announced at the Nuclear Security Summit in 2012. And I was agog that it was, well, A, I was very happy it was done, and B, that, oh, this is now public. But that certainly, again, concentrated the mind, where the discoveries of the weaknesses at Degelin Mountain, that closing the test tunnels was not enough.
Yeah, it was very similar in that regard, because in the early 2000s, we thought we were done, right, with infrastructure elimination, and it's hard. You mentioned the bureaucracy to say, wait a minute, nope, there's still more. And only, I think, through those relationships we had built with organizations like the National Nuclear Center, but also the work of folks like Dr. Sighecker and the lab-to-lab cooperation, working with the Russian labs to really get a better feeling for what was there, and to work that up and say, there's more work to be done, and maybe in some cases more urgent work than even what we had done in the 90s.
If I could add, I think that our sequencing of infrastructure first and then material security as a follow-on was in some ways an accident of history, but it was a positive one, because I don't think we ever could have done the material security work, particularly with the Russians, without the trust and the close relationships that were built up during the infrastructure elimination period. that if we had just gone in and saying, "Oh, let us deal with this nuclear material," it would not have been a very positive response, particularly from the Russians.
That's a good point, because when you look at it from a pure risk standpoint, the material is a greater risk than leaving silos as they were, for example, without being blown up and things like that. But building that trust is critically important.
So we'll ask a few more questions to both of you as we wrap up our discussion. You've both obviously made a career in nonproliferation and arms control. How do the efforts at Semipalatinsk stack up against some of the other complex and consequential issues that you've worked with in the past to resolve? We'll start with Dr. Coch.
It was a very high. We did so much in so many countries that was so important. I continue to think that nuclear warhead elimination, removal, the fact that we have 3 states that are members in good standing as non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT is enormously important. And also with time, particularly as things change politically, having the elimination of the strategic nuclear delivery vehicles from those 3 states, important. Degelin Mountain, extremely important from a very specific standpoint of infrastructure that can never be used again, and nuclear material security under very, very difficult conditions. It also symbolically is very important because it was such a microcosm of Cold War arms race rivalry, and for it to be destroyed was a major political achievement as well.
Ambassador Courtney, how would you stack up the work at Semipalatinsk with some of the other efforts you've been involved in?
So let me answer in the context of overall nuclear cooperation with Kazakhstan. So that has been remarkably successful and done really through a cooperative effort that is almost unique, at least in my experience. But by and large, the bipartisan support of the United States for nonproliferation, for arms control, most recently seen in President Biden's extension of the New START treaty for another 5 years, has received bipartisan support in Congress for the most part. So, this field of nonproliferation arms control is one in which we all labor in our own small way, but it's been a pretty successful effort for the United States in the post-war era.
Dr. Coch, what would you say to the average American citizen about the worthiness of the United States working in Kazakhstan to secure Semipalatinsk?
I think if the average American citizen knows about the work, he or she understands the importance. In July 2000, when we had a ceremony for the destruction of the last tunnel at STS, Kazakhstan Minister of Atomic Energy, close colleague Vladimir Shkolnik, and I presided over the ceremony. CNN International carried it. The next day, I was flying home, and on the plane, someone came up to me and asked if I was who I was. And when I acknowledged it, he thanked me on behalf of his children and his grandchildren. It is something I will never forget. It was such a good reminder of why we're in this business.
Great story.
Isn't it? Isn't it?
Yes.
It's why you get up in the morning,
Yep.
So he understood, and he was just a person.
Which I think goes to speak to why it's important that we share these stories, right? It's easy to labor under the secrecy of national security, to get this work done, and that's very important. But at the same time, I think it's incredibly important to share that as well, so that the world pays attention to these types of threats in the future and doesn't just assume that there are no more out there to be dealt with.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, this goes to the contribution that DITRA makes to national security. It is only a small part of the Department of Defense, but it does enjoy bipartisan support, and it has made an enormous contribution, thanks in great part to support from Senator Nunn and Senator Lugar, and consistent bipartisan support since they took the initiative.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of kind of the vision of CTR and how impressive that was with, Senator Nunn, Senator Lugar, whenever they first dreamt this up. I think you mentioned it earlier, how there was no model for this, no blueprint. But the vision to create that and then to have it be so successful and so adaptable and flexible to solve these issues is a great testament to them and to the program.
And of course, after 2001, when the Bush 43 review said this is a good program, and thereby sort of solidifying bipartisan support, we began to get more flexibility in the program. The annual certification requirements that people may have forgotten about, but they were very difficult for us year in and year out, delayed work as we prepared the reports to Congress about why a given recipient met the certification requirements. Those were eliminated. And the limitation, more important, the limitation of the program to former Soviet states was, of course, lifted and or made less onerous. The program has so much more flexibility now.
When you think back about the origins of a lot of DITRA activities, so the On-Site Inspection Agency was created to facilitate on-site inspections for the INF treaty initially, and then played a greater role for START treaty and other activities. That was a wholly new activity, had never been carried out before by U.S. government, much less the Defense Department. And then the CTR program came along to help pay for dismantling, neutralizing infrastructure weapons mass destruction around the world. And then as it evolved, and Dr. Koch was directly involved in the Proliferation Security Initiative and the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, these were all multilateral efforts of a kind that had practical application to reduce nuclear risk. And we had never done that sort of thing before. Prior to these activities, most what we had done was negotiate treaties, international treaties, multilateral, bilateral with Soviet Union, but we hadn't really gotten involved as a government in some of the practical application of reducing nuclear threats. So DITRA, if you will, combines a pretty unique set of innovative activities in the defense and foreign policy sphere.
We keep referring to DITRA, but of course, for the first several years of CTR, there was no DITRA. If I recall correctly, DITRA was created in 1998. Do I have that right? So the CTR mission was given basically to the On-Site Inspection Agency. There was a CTR office, but it was co-located at Dulles with OSIA and with also help from what by then was the Defense Special Weapons Agency, former the Defense Nuclear Agency, and later also to be part of DITRA. There is a direct administrative link between the On-Site Inspection Agency and CTR, just as there is a substantive link in the going from monitoring START 1 implementation, for example, to actually implementing START 1.
Ambassador Courtney, what would you say to current U.S. government officials about the need to maintain vigilance against the potential proliferation threats from a former nuclear test site like Semipalatinsk?
Secretary of State George Shultz had a word called gardening. His notion was that while there are foreign policy crises of various times that probably require most of the attention of senior leaders, that it's important to garden other activities. And this is one of those in which Semipalatinsk activities by DITRA have made a great contribution to U.S. national security, but they don't require high-level attention every day, but they do require sustained activities, sustained support. And so, like some other activities that require gardening, this is one that U.S. government officials need to pay attention to on a consistent basis.
And Dr. Cook, how about you? What would you recommend to current U.S. government officials?
Be open to doing whatever we can. That we've learned from STS that if the day, for example, if the day should ever come that we had a cooperative or a not terribly cooperative denuclearization program with another state, to be aware that we would certainly want to eliminate their nuclear program infrastructure of all sorts. That would still be a high priority. But to be aware of the lurking proliferation dangers in a way that we were not before the work on STS. And now we would know what to look for and what to do about it. So hopefully this work was path-breaking and we'll have an opportunity to go down the path again.
With that, we'll close the conversation. Thank you both for your time today and for being part of this great history. And thank you for those taking the time to listen. We hope you enjoy this series of conversations and our year-long celebration to commemorate and tell the story of Semipalatinsk. Please continue to watch for new content on DITRA's website, dtra.mil, and through social media using the hashtags SecuringSemipalatinsk and CTR30.